Hey everyone, it's the Kung Fu Genius, aka Alex Richter, here with a special episode for you. This is a crossover episode of the Dudes of Kung Fu podcast's Quarantined Conversations. This time I interview my good friend Dr. Kenneth Jay on topics like real cardiovascular training, tendon strength protocols, Bruce Lee, and how he trains UFC fighter Nicolas Dalby's conditioning for his fights. He's got an extensive resume. Here we go. Dr. Kenneth Jay holds a master's degree in exercise physiology with a specialty in cardiovascular function and a PhD in sports science and clinical biomechanics. He is a researcher based in Denmark and an adjunct professor of human performance and clinical biomechanics at the Carrick Institute in Orlando, Florida. With 20 plus years of experience in the fitness industry and more than a decade of consulting experience for international and Olympic level athletes, Kenneth Jay has instructed and coached some of the best. In 2014, Kenneth Jay authored the Cardio Code and created the Cardio Code and Kinetic Code certification courses. With a deep interest in the link between body and brain, Kenneth Jay specializes in a neurophysio biomechanical approach to health and performance enhancement. He looks like Thor, too, and that helps a lot. I feel like a child next to him. Anyway, I was more than delighted to talk to one of my mentors in physical training, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Here's Dudes of Kung Fu Quarantine Conversations with the Kung Fu Genius and the great Dr. Kenneth Jay.
And every day I practice martial arts.
Watch out!
Word is I'm a kung fu genius.
Cool. So, hey, Kenneth, it's nice to see you. How have you been these days?
I've been great, circumstances notwithstanding. It's crazy times, but I'm doing good, healthy, and yeah, just trying to get stuff done.
Right. Do you feel that you're even busier now in these days than you were before all this stuff happened? I feel like I have twice as much work now as I did before.
Yeah, I've actually heard a few people say the exact same thing. I'm finding that my schedule keeps getting rearranged. But the thing is with what I do every day is that I basically work from home, and I can pretty much organize the day as I see fit. So it hasn't been that big of a change. But of course, some things are impacted by the whole COVID-19 thing.
Sure. Do you have a whole training setup at your house? So you're one of those people that doesn't need a gym anyway, or what is it? Is your training schedule different now, or what are you doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. See, back in the day when I used to do a lot of kettlebell training, I had my outdoor courage corner, which was basically like a really trashy outdoor gym that was like built of whatever I had laying around, and then I had some plates and a barbell and kettlebells and stuff like that. But I basically got rid of that because I had kids, and then they needed the place for a trampoline.
Right.
So I had to give that up. I have a rower at my office. It's right behind me here, and then I have a K box, which is the device that allows you to do heavy eccentric work. I have a few bells, and then I have that's basically it. I have a couple of sandbags and stuff like that. So that's what I use.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I have a rower as well. It's at my school, but before we went on lockdown, I drove to my school, opened up my trunk, and put the rower in there because I'm like, if there's a couple of pieces of equipment that I want, the rower is definitely one of them. And I definitely want to talk to you a little bit later, especially for our listeners, to kind of get an idea of what phenomenal piece of equipment this simple yet very sadistic rowing machine is, and why everyone needs to get on one. Before we get into that, I just want to let our listeners know that in addition to being extremely credentialed in fitness and sports physiology, all that kind of stuff, you also do have some martial arts training, although I know you always like to downplay it a little bit, but maybe you can tell the audience some of the things that you have practiced.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. As long as nobody really challenged me to a fight, then I'll be good. I wouldn't want that. But yes, I do have some martial arts background, and I've been fascinated with martial arts ever since I was a kid, basically. So I grew up watching the Bruce Lee movies. I really loved also the movies that Brandon made. Watching those, and grew up watching American Ninja and those old school 80s martial arts movies. And I started with Shotokan Karate when I was 8 or 9, I believe, and I stayed with that for about 3 years. And then I decided to try different things, basically. So when I was probably a few years after that, I had a couple of years where I didn't do any martial arts. But then when I was about 14, I started doing a little bit of Wing Chun, actually. Stayed with that for a couple of years. Trained in Copenhagen. I'm in Denmark, so I trained in Copenhagen under Henning Davern, as
right.
you probably recognize, and your listeners will probably recognize.
He's my Siheng, my older kung fu brother. So it's actually from the same family. Yeah.
Oh yeah, very cool. Tried that for probably about 2 years or so. Tried out some capoeira. Tried out wrestling. I pretty much stuck with wrestling, and now it's all transitioning into BJJ and MMA and those types of mixed stuff. Submission wrestling, kickboxing. Whenever I'm on the West Coast, I try to stop by the Inosano Academy, talk to Guru there, and Dr. Mark Ching, who's a friend of both of us. He always makes an effort to teach me some of his skills whenever I'm there. So I like to be exposed to all these things, and I wouldn't say on a regular basis, but quite frequently. I also do a little bit of mixed stuff with the UFC fighter that I'm training. So he gets to beat me up, and I get to beat him up at the gym, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm gonna destroy him on the rower, basically.
Yeah, so we have luckily I was able to meet Nicolas Dalby through you by introduction in Los Angeles a few years back, and it's really incredible to see his journey and to see what he's gone through. He was in the UFC, and then he was out for a bit, and now he's back in the UFC. Had an amazing win in his first fight back over, what was it, Alex Oliveira, which is an incredible fighter. It was unbelievable. Yeah, so what is it like, training with, as you said, you kick his ass on the rower, but he kicks your ass in training. So what is it like on that end when you're training with him on the martial arts side, just to give some of our listeners an idea of what it's like, the intensity that a professional fighter trains with?
Oh, I think he actually turns it down all the way to very close to zero when I step on the mat with him. He's very good at making sure I don't get hurt, but he also is very good at pushing me in all the right places. I do actually believe that he only goes about 10% or so, or 5% whenever I wrestle with him, and even lower when we hit the pads or when we spar. Because the amount of speed and power that he has, and the endurance for that matter, it's I'm a big guy and I'm pretty muscular, but I can't match that. I don't have a chance. So I have plenty to deal with when we're on the mat. But again, like I said, when then it's time to hit the gym, he can outwork me, but I create the programs, right? I can make sure that his program is going to be equally taxing, if not more. So that's where I can kind of get him back.
Yeah. So speaking of big guy, because for our listeners who don't know what you look like, how tall are you? But you got to do it in feet, like American style.
Yeah, so I'm 6'4", and I think I was about 210 the last time you saw me. About 200 pounds now, so I'm a little bit leaner, but I'm usually considered a semi big guy. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, all the photos where I'm next to you, I just feel like a child next to a proper adult. And you've even at Starbucks, I always think the funniest thing when they ask you your name, you sometimes jokingly tell them Thor, and no one
Yeah.
is going to think twice about that. They're like, yeah, he looks like a Thor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I kind of like to do that. Yeah, that's true.
So we mentioned the rower a moment ago, and obviously the rower is probably the centerpiece of what you do when you train Nicholas for the conditioning portion. There are a lot of misconceptions about what cardio training is, especially if you go online. You have all these Instagram celebrities selling all sorts of nonsense. You buy an ebook and then a quick video, and then you're going to have six-pack abs and you're going to look oiled and perfect in 3 weeks. And I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about what cardio is. I think people think anytime they're sweating that means that they're doing cardio. Can you explain, especially for laymen like us and people who just practice martial arts as a hobby, what
Mhm.
cardiovascular training really is and what it's not in terms of what people usually say it is? Like, give us an idea.
Absolutely. It would be my pleasure. It's kind of one of my pet peeves, actually, to dispel the myths of what is cardio and what is not cardio. Actually, I'm also going to do a shameless plug. I have a book that's called The Cardio Code, and that goes into the details about it. But in that book, I kind of start opening up with a phrase saying that if all it takes to do cardio is to increase your heart rate when you're exercising, that means that I could also improve your cardio by scaring you into better shape. Basically means that the misconception is that anything that will elevate your heart rate is also gonna be a cardiovascular stimulus, and that is a misconception because when we lift weights, we can pick up a heavy barbell or heavy kettlebells and do a bunch of squats with it, for instance, and that's gonna elevate our heart rate. And some people can actually get to very close to maximal heart rate levels just by doing heavy squats. And then the problem arises when you start to equate that with a cardiovascular stimulus, because that is the high heart rate is a response to the lack of oxygen in the muscles, and it actually does not stimulate the cardiovascular system in any positive way. So what we're looking for when we talk about cardio training, or in the old days as boxers used to like to refer to as doing road work, right?
Right.
That basically means that that you have to stimulate your heart in such a way that it starts to expand, right? Kind of like a balloon. And that happens when you run, when you row, when you bike, or if you have the option of doing cross-country skiing. So basically, those four activities have an effect on the heart. So when you push the intensity, that will make the heart kind of expand like a balloon. The thing is that when we lift weights, that expansion of the heart actually does not happen. What does happen, however, is because when you have a load on your back or you're lifting something heavy, you have to contract all of your muscles in order to stabilize against the weight. And that means also, in particular, you have to contract the muscles that surround your torso and surround your heart. And what that does is that it basically restricts blood flow going back from the muscles and into the heart again. And what that does is that it actually increases the thickness of the heart wall. So basically, if you think about the balloon again, instead of like blowing it up so it expands, so the inside cavity gets bigger, now the thickness of the rubber, balloon rubber, starts to grow, and it grows inward, and that means that there's less room for blood in that inside cavity, and that actually is a negative effect of strength training or weight training on your heart. So those two are very different. You have to basically, what I go back to is if it's not running, rowing, biking, or skiing, it's not really cardio. Again, if you take a sedentary person that's never done anything and you just make him do push-ups and pull-ups if they can, or body weight squats, they're going to get some slight benefit on the cardiovascular system, but not on the heart. They're going to get an effect outside in the muscles. So it's really important not to confuse the effects that weight training creates and those other four activities, what those create of effects.
So, well, I think that's a fantastic explanation. In fact, that's the explanation you gave me many years ago when I did the cardio code cert, and that's the one I try to tell people. But it seems that there's still a lot of pushback because, for example, in martial arts, people think, well, what about hitting the bags? What if I hit the bags at a high level intensity? Isn't that also cardio? And it seems from what you're saying, it might be for a noob, like they might get some kind of beginning effect. So explain to our listeners why hitting the bag, even at a really high level of intensity, is still not necessarily cardiovascular training, because they seem to not want to believe that.
Yeah. So the whole and we may have to at least scratch the surface in some physiology here in this explanation. But basically, in order to create that stimulus to the heart, well, actually, let me start a different place. So cardio, when we say cardio, we mean cardiovascular training. Cardio means heart, right? It's a Greek word, and it basically directly translated means heart. So when we do cardio training, we're training our heart, or we intend to train our heart. The way we train our heart, the way we want it to improve is that we wanted to improve our stamina and our endurance. And that can only happen if we expand the heart. And that's why those four activities are key in that process. Now, if we start to look at activities like hitting the bag or doing really continuous prolonged Wing Chun dummy, the Junfan sets, or whatever, doing that at a high intensity, we may start to feel fatigue, and we may start to breathe heavy and start to sweat, but the amount of active muscle mass is not sufficient enough to create the stimulus needed to create the adaptations of the heart. So there's an element here of the amount of active muscle mass that has to be fulfilled in order for the heart to force that adaptation of that expansion of the heart. So one of the things is that we have to look at active amount of muscle mass. Then we have to look at a contraction relaxation cycle. So if you tighten your muscles really tightly and keep them tight and then relax and then tighten them again, most of the time you're under tension. That also limits the stimulus to the heart expansion. And then we have to look at basically what you could refer to as RPMs, or repetitions per minute. That also has to be above a certain threshold. That may not be a problem because Wing Chun guys can really throw a lot of punches in a very short amount of time. But still, the lack of active muscle mass in those punches is definitely a limiting factor there. And again, also if people are not if people get too tense and too tight in the muscles, that's also going to limit it. And then again, if in activities where you do stuff at a slower pace, then the repetitions per minute is also going to be a limiting factor. So there are all these factors that contribute either to this expansion of the heart or to other localized effects. So the next question that some people might be thinking when they hear this explanation is that, why is it that my endurance then goes up after I've practiced whatever movement and I can stay, keep punching the heavy bag for a longer period of time? Well, that's all local muscular adaptations, because we have the heart and then we have what goes on in the muscles. And in the muscles, they can create muscular endurance. That basically means if you create a stimulus of doing a lot of intervals of heavy bag punching, short rest, and then do it again, then we create an environment in the muscles that forces the muscles to adapt and create more what's called mitochondria, basically. It creates more mitochondria, and the muscles get better at removing the lactic acid that builds up if you go really fast. But that's a local adaptation that has nothing to do with your heart.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. Because yeah, I think people do feel, well, if I do heavy bag training regularly, I get better at it. I'm able to do it longer. And then of course they're going to equate that to cardio training, but I think it's very important for people to realize that these are two different systems essentially that are working there. Wow, that's yeah, that's really, other people I think that, well, what if I just lift weights faster? And I guess that has the same problem of, in terms of the intensity and the amount of contraction versus relaxation, or why is lifting weights faster not really a way to do cardio, so to speak?
That's also a great question. And that actually, that whole phrase of, you've probably seen those memes where it says there's a conversation between two people, and one guy asks the other, hey, what do you do for training? I lift weights. Then what do you do for cardio training? I lift weights faster, is usually. And that meme is actually what got me to write the cardio code book, because I was like, oh my God, that's so wrong. And I'm going to write a book about it. And it's kind of the thing, someone's wrong on the internet, or basically the entire internet in this case is basically wrong. The thing is that when we lift weights, is that we're usually under pretty significant load, which means that our muscles have to contract in order to stay upright and to support the weight. Already there, we're creating an environment within the body where the muscles are not getting any oxygen that's being pumped by the heart. Because a contracted muscle, when a muscle contracts, it basically restricts the blood flow to it. And when it then relaxes, then the blood can enter it. But if most of the time, when we're actually doing a set of, let's say, 10 squats, most of the time we're actually contracting against the load, which means that the muscles are not actually getting any oxygen in there. At the same time, what's happening is that the blood flow going back to the heart is also restricted, again, because of what's called the intrathoracic pressure, the pressure that you have to keep in your abdomen and in your chest in order to support the weight. So that restricts blood flow going back to the heart. And if there's no blood being pumped back to the heart, then what is going to make it expand? Well, nothing. There's nothing there to make it expand. Even if you could do like really fast squats, we've probably all seen the YouTube clips of CrossFitters doing like air squats where they just use body weight and go up and down. Even in such cases, it's going to be very hard to create any significant effects on that heart expansion, simply because the time under tension, or the time you spend being in a contracted state, is going to be so high, and you're going to restrict the blood flowing back to the heart as well. Because again, you have to do some level of bracing, if you will, some level of holding your breath, either fully or just semi-holding your breath, and that is enough to restrict the blood flowing back to the heart. And again, if there's no blood going back to the heart, there's nothing to force that expansion.
Got it. So you talk about 4 exercises essentially being kind of the gold standard for cardio. We have running, we have biking, we have rowing, and cross-country skiing. Now, of those, clearly you like the rower. You like specifically the Concept 2 rower. You got me onto it. It's been an absolute life-changing thing for me. Perhaps let people know why maybe a rower is one of the more efficient ways, or why you're a little bit more, and I don't know if I'm putting words into your mouth, why you might be more partial to the rower compared to other forms, or maybe it just might seem that way.
Well, I may be a little biased towards the rower, but I think, to be honest, I think I'm biased for a couple of good reasons. Well, number one is that rowing actually activates more than 85% of your total musculoskeletal system. So when you row, there's a push from the legs, which is basically your quadriceps and everything in your lower body that pushes off. And then your back is being activated, and then your arms are what finishes each stroke. And then going forward again, you have all this abdomen activation. You actually also, if you look at activation of different muscle groups in the upper body, then you'll see rowers have high degrees of activation in their pectorals, their chest muscles. So basically, the amount of active muscle mass is way up there, right? And that's one of the key things that's necessary in order to stimulate the heart to do this expansion. You need a lot of muscle mass to be activated. The next thing is that what I like with the rower is that it actually also requires muscular force. So you have to generate a lot more muscular force per stroke in order to create the same amount of work, right? So this is how I usually compare it. This is if you for instance, and you know, because we've talked about this and you've attended the cardio coach certification several times, is that I talk about the amount of work being done. And this is also one of the reasons why I like the rowing machine, is because it's basically an ergometer that tells you exactly how much work you're doing every single second. And that's what called watts. The display on the rowing machine will tell you how many watts you're generating. And watts are energy, right? So if you want to generate higher amounts of watts, that means you have to work harder. Now, the thing is that let's say we sit on the rower and we start to row and we generate 200 watts. And we do that with 20 strokes per minute, right? That's the rower. If we do the equivalent amount of work on a bicycle, for instance, we do 200 watts of work on a bike, our RPMs on the bike may be 60 or 80 or maybe even 100 repetitions per minute, right? So if we compare 20 reps per minute on the rower to 100 rounds per minute on the bike, but for the same work, that basically means that for each stroke, each of the 20 strokes that we take on the rower, we have to generate much more force because we only have 20 strokes to do it per minute, whereas the bike will have maybe 100 strokes or 100 repetitions per minute. So we have to generate 5 times as much force per stroke on the rower than what the person on the bike does. So what that tells us is that for each stroke, there has to be a higher force output. And if there's a higher force output, it stimulates more strength. It requires more strength, and it activates more of the explosive and the fast muscle fibers in the body. And this is very evident if we look at rowers' bodies compared to cyclists or runners. Rowers are usually very muscular and quite lean, whereas, and also in their upper body, whereas take a road cyclist, they have very well-developed legs, but they don't really have anything in their upper body. And if we compare the thigh muscles on a rower and a cyclist, they're also very different, where the rower will be much more explosive and still basically just as enduring, but they will have much more explosive power, simply because it takes more power, more force per stroke to generate an equivalent amount of work. Yeah.
Wow. So, so to get on, obviously within a 45-minute podcast, we can't go into programming and all this kind of stuff, which is why I recommend people get your book, The Cardio Code, if they want more information on that, or take one of the certs. But maybe you can give us an idea, for example, for training a UFC fighter, standard MMA fight, 3 rounds, 5-minute rounds. There's a 1-minute break. Championship fight is 5 rounds. So let's say you're training a fighter to go for those 3 rounds. They got to be able to go for 5 minutes with a 1-minute break. What kind of training protocol, like a basic outline, we don't have to go into all the brutal detail, but what would be like a basic progression building up to that? And also, do you then taper off at the very end to make sure that they're not overtrained? Like, how do those things work? I'm always very fascinated how they put them together.
And there's so much detail that we could go into with this. If we look at what I do with Nicolas, for instance, is that we have certain periods where we train when we work on basic strength and explosiveness. Then we transition that a little bit into more faster, more powerful movements, but still without taxing him in terms of fatigue or anything. As we approach probably about 6 weeks out of a fight, we have to spend those last remaining 6 weeks leading up to the fight developing his his ability to keep going, to deliver high force outputs, but do it while he's basically huffing and puffing and trying to catch his breath, right? So that's what I call tolerance training, because fighting is basically very anaerobic whenever you engage. But in order to last 3 times 5 minutes, that's 15 minutes only separated by a couple of breaks, lasting only 1 minute. So it's actually also aerobically demanding, right? So what I do in order to prepare him for that is basically doing simulation. So I construct workouts that usually are 3 to 4 rounds of maybe 5 or 6 minutes, very similar to what he's going to be exposed to. But the rules are that we have to tax the major muscle groups. So I require him to do a lot of heavy explosive lifting in those rounds. But I want him to do it while he's basically really taxed and his chest is pounding and he's trying to catch his breath. So usually what will happen is that for each round, the first minute will be basically an all-out row. And then he'll have maybe, as an example, we could go directly from the rower. He could go into doing trap bar deadlifts, for instance, that are fairly heavy, or throwing a wrestling dummy, like doing suplexes with a wrestling dummy for 1 minute. Then from there, we could go into doing maybe some kettlebell cleans and presses. And then we'll probably do some medicine ball slams into the ground. And then I'll hit him with another minute to really ramp up his heart rate and to make him breathe heavy, training that ability to get in a lot of oxygen. And then he gets a little bit of rest, and then we'll do it over again. So at the beginning and the end at every round, we'll basically tax him heavily with something that elevates his lactate. So basically what happens, the reason why why I choose to finish each round with basically at 1 minute all out rowing is that he's not going to be able to recover from that in the minute that we're resting, right? So he'll come into the next round being already fatigued, and now he has to do another minute of all out rowing to start that round. So there's a huge, it's almost an exponential increase in fatigue, in muscular fatigue. And the whole idea is that the better his cardiovascular system is to begin with, the better his aerobic base is, the better he'll be able to handle the recovery during those intensive 3 times 5 minute rounds. So basically, before we reach the 6 weeks out phase, we spent a lot of time building his aerobic base in training as well. So before leading up to those 6 weeks, he's been rowing many kilometers and spent quite a long time on the rowing machine just to be able to prepare for that. And the reason we do it this way, and the reason why we don't spend his entire training only doing like fight specific stuff, is that it takes the body about 4 to 6 weeks before we max out his anaerobic tolerance capacity. So after about 6 weeks of really hard, intensive training, maybe doing this 3, 4, 5 times a week, then he's going to be maxed out on his ability both to produce lactate and to tolerate that lactate as well. And trying to push longer than that will actually end up being detrimental. So that's why we have this 6 week window at the end.
Got it. Wow. That's incredible. And I think, and anyone who has not used the rower before, they might think, oh, like a rower, 1 minute all out, you don't know. I remember the first time I went on the rower, and I think the first thing you made me do was the 2K all out test. That was literally the first thing that I did. And I get on that thing after some basic instruction, and you have to sprint those first 100 meters or so. And I'm sprinting, I'm going like, okay, and then suddenly once you get past that sprint and you have to get into it, kind of a nice, really strong stroke, and you look and you go, I still have 1,800 left to go. And then and it's almost, and what I feel, I mean, regardless of the fact that it's extremely physically fatiguing, especially when you're doing all out stuff, there's a mental component. And I think that that's what really draws me the most to it, because it's like martial arts. It's like your ability to master your mind and to endure. And there's always a moment when you go like, okay, you can go a little lighter on the next 100 meters. And then there's the other voice going like, lighter, you're gonna be done in 3 minutes. Why don't you just push it now and then stop your complaining, right? So you constantly have this like the kind of the angel and the demon on your shoulders fighting for it. And I think it's a tremendous way to train your mental fortitude, which is also very important when you're doing, especially for competitive fighters. And I think if you row regularly, there's really nothing you can't put your mind to, because it's probably one of the most difficult things to do.
Absolutely. It's actually it's quite well known in the training industry, and especially training elite athletes and Olympic athletes, is that the Olympic sport of rowing, the 2K, is actually considered the hardest event of them all. And it's basically because it's what requires the most of you, both in terms of what you described right there, but also in terms of they have to have the ability to tolerate tremendous levels of pain. Because what happens at a 2K row on the water in a single sculler, that will take maybe 6.5 minutes for an Olympic class rower, right? But they will actually row, it will take about 30 seconds or so, maybe a minute, and then they'll be very close to their maximal heart rate. And then they'll stay within 1, 2, 3 beats of their maximal heart rate for the remaining part of the race. That's 5 minutes. But what's also interesting is that as they push the cardiovascular system, lactate levels start to increase as well, right? And lactate levels are basically what is causing a huge pH level drop in your bloodstream. So that means that your body becomes increasingly acidic. Your blood and your tissue becomes acidic. At one point, acidity can become even fatal, right? And it's what makes people stop and throw up, basically. Now, the interesting thing is that an Olympic level rower will sit at a lactate level concentration, meaning a pH level that's so low that if we copied that and took that blood and put it into a person that hasn't been trained, that person would probably die, right? And they stay there for 5 or 6 minutes. And that's so incredible, right? So to compare, I used to train another, he's actually a UFC fighter as well. And he's a former Greco-Roman wrestler. He took silver in Beijing.
What about Mark Madsen?
He took silver in Greco-Roman in Rio. It's Mark Madsen. You've probably seen him as well. And if you dig up an old copy of my book, Viking Warrior Conditioning, with the kettlebell stuff, you'll see an interview with him at the end of it when he was still a Greco-Roman wrestler. Now the thing is, compared to wrestling, you will see lactate levels during a fight of maybe 15, 16, maybe 20, what's called millimoles of lactate per liter of blood. I know we're using the metric system here. Really, that's painful. That is true. That's where you feel like your arms are just gonna fall off. You feel like you're throwing up, and you're dizzy, and you have that metally taste in your mouth, and everything bad you remember from really hard training. You'll probably sit around 15 millimoles per liter, right? A rower, he will spend almost the entire 2K race at around 27 to 30 millimoles per liter. That's the only sport where they go so high. And it's actually been said that when you do studies at the university testing lactate threshold and maximum capacity for handling lactate, they will usually stop you. If you haven't stopped, they will stop you at around 30, 31 millimoles, because that's where it starts to get lethal, right? And think about that. A rower will sit right at that edge, and they're not, when they're done, they're not rolling around on the floor because they're on the water. They're simply just sitting and breathing in their sculler. So that's that's something that's trainable, but it's not trainable without that mental fortitude that you were talking about before. It's unbelievable.
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, and I definitely recommend people try it out. It's definitely an experience to know what that feels like. But make sure that you get some kind of competent instruction first, because I've seen people using Concept 2s at public gyms. You know, it's just basically doing bicep curls, sitting in place, and and all sorts of crazy stuff. So before we get out of here, we spent a majority of this episode talking about cardiovascular strength. I want to talk a little bit about something that's talked a lot about in traditional martial arts, which is the tendon training, tendon strength, which, you know, most people, when they think about, you know, training their power, they think about training the muscles, they think about, doing a lot of normal gym stuff. Why is training the tendons important, and how can we train the tendons to improve athletic performance?
And that's you hit on another, let's say, pet peeve of mine, and something that I'm so fascinated by, and it's probably also one of the things that where I realize is that martial artists, most martial artists at least, they have an advantage in that area, because basically, in order to provide a little bit of background, and I know we're short of time here, but the tendon is so important because the tendon is what attaches the muscle to the bone. So you have a muscle, then there's the tendon, and then the tendon attaches to the bone, right? When the muscle contracts, it pulls on the tendon, and that makes the bone move around the joint, right? So the thing is that for aesthetics, yes, you want to focus on building the big muscle and all of that. That's the whole bodybuilding aspect. But for sports performance, for martial arts, for anything else, then what you gotta be aware of is that the muscle will grow much faster, both in size and in force generation capacity, than the tendon will. So that means that there has to be some sort of braking mechanism put on the muscle, because if the muscle contracts at, let's say 100 pounds of contractile force, but the tendon can only handle maybe 50 pounds of force, then the nervous system, which is basically the braking mechanism here, is going to say, hey, in order for you not to injure yourself, I'm going to turn down that muscular output so the tendon doesn't break. So even if the muscle contracts at 100 pounds, it will probably only transfer about 30 pounds of force through that tendon, because we need also a safety margin, right? So if the tendon will break at 50 pounds, it'll probably turn the force transfer all the way down to 30 pounds through it, right? And that's a huge discrepancy. So if you got 100 pounds of force capacity in the muscle, but only 30 pounds gets through it, then you have a deficit of 70 pounds, right? That means that your muscle is wasting 70 pounds basically, or you're wasting in that. So can you imagine if you could increase your punching power or speed by 70%, right? That would be huge. So this is actually why I'm so interested in tendon training, because if we can target tendons and stimulate those to grow at a slightly faster rate, that means that we can even out the discrepancy between the muscle and the tendon, which means that we will have the nervous system will allow more of the force being transferred through it. So that basically leads to, okay, so how do we basically train our tendons? Tendons are not that responsive of strength training as the muscles are. And the thing is with tendons is that they also need to be stimulated from various angles. And this may also be one of the reasons why people from martial arts, they get into much more, let's say, compromised positions or different positions that the normal person in the gym will do, right? So, and especially like we've talked about so many times, is that, and especially in Kung Fu, is that you do all sorts of not only flexion and extension, but you also do a lot of twisting and turning and stuff like that. And all of those positions, they pull on the structure, they pull on the structural tissue from all different directions. That basically means that already by forcing your joints to be in awkward positions, you're stretching on the tendons in directions that are not being addressed in the gym. And that creates new growth because that's the new stimulus. And then there's the other aspect of it. And actually, this is something that I know we've also talked about extensively. You'll see those old pictures of Bruce Lee doing those isometric exercises where he pushes against the bar and stuff like that. He was very smart. He did that intuitively, I suspect, because what isometrics does is that it basically picks up the slack of the tendon and starts to load it continuously. And when you load something isometrically, you cannot, the short impulse, you're kind of overriding the nervous system in that point and telling it keep pushing force through the tendon because you're constantly keeping the tension engaged, right? And that basically means that by doing that, you're also creating a growth stimulus that's very much targeted the soft tissue, being the tendons. And where do we see a lot of isometrics and twisted positions? Well, we see that in most martial arts, right? You see it in wrestlers as well because they get into all these compromised, twisted, turned, flexed, extended positions. And oftentimes they'll have to generate some isometric force in there as well. And that is one of the keys of developing both healthy joints, but also very strong tendons. And I think it's tremendously overlooked in the sports industry and in sports training in general. I definitely think that if we took a group of high-level martial artists and compared them to a high-level group of some other sport, and we used ultrasound to look at the tendons, I have no doubt who will come out on top in terms of having the biggest and strongest tendons. That's definitely going to be the martial artists.
Right. Interesting. I always wondered too, because in my 18 years of teaching martial arts, I've had a number of bodybuilders that have trained with me. And it's interesting to compare the movement capabilities of bodybuilders with, for example, dancers who you can tell a dancer to do anything and they'll be able to do it. Bodybuilder, not always, although I do actually have a private student who's a former Mr. Universe, and but he also has very good movement training because he also did a lot of body weight stuff in addition to his bodybuilding routine. But he has the one thing that I've never seen a high level bodybuilder who didn't have it, which is that he tore his bicep. His bicep tendon ripped, and then the bicep goes all the way up into the shoulder, and then they have to have the surgery. But he even told me that when his bicep ripped, he saw it and he continued his set of curls afterwards anyway, which is like, how crazy is that? Now, is that an example of the muscle output far exceeding what the tendon is able to handle? Is that basically the classic example?
That is spot on. That's basically well, maybe not the part where he continued to do his bicep curls afterwards, but the whole thing is that when you train, and especially at least some bodybuilders, they get fired up with a lot of adrenaline, right? When they go and train, which basically puts a damper on the protective mechanism from the nervous system, right? Because we've all heard the stories of if you're really in trouble and you're fighting for your life, you can summon some strength that you have never seen before. That's basically adrenaline. That's not something magical. That's basically adrenaline that's just taking over, right? And usually what happens in such cases is that because he's so maybe fired up, high levels of adrenaline, high levels of arousal, and he just wants to really hit his biceps hard, then maybe the nervous system was not as good at protecting him. So basically more of the muscular force that was generated was actually transferred through the tendon, and the tendon couldn't hold it, so it basically just ripped. There's another aspect of that, and it's not because we're going to go deep into it, but bodybuilders, at least at high levels, they use some sort of, let's call it chemical enhancements, right?
Spicy vitamins, we like to call them.
Yeah. So they like the sauce, right? And what the sauce basically does is that it targets the anabolic receptors that are in the muscles. So now we have a situation where the muscular tissue will grow even faster than the tendon tissue. So now we're creating this huge deficit between muscle capacity and tendon capacity that grows, right? And that just sets you up for injury. And that's also one of the reasons why you'll see people who strength train a lot, they'll usually have a lot of, if not fully torn, either biceps or pecs or similar, they will have semi-torn soft tissue. It can be both the chemical enhancements, but probably also the huge rushes of adrenaline that they put themselves through. And if they don't specifically train the tendons to handle that and focus on that, then at one point that stuff is going to happen.
Sure. So one question's been burning on my mind is how come you haven't been on Joe Rogan yet? I think given your expertise and given the kind of things he likes to talk about, sometimes he has some really great guests on there, and they talk about obviously training and fitness and cardio and stuff. And sometimes they have great conversations. And sometimes, and I'm not an expert. I've just been lucky enough to hang out with some very high level experts like you and Dr. Mark Chang. And sometimes I hear some of his guests say things where I just go, when is he going to get Kenneth Jay on? Because I think I think you would do an amazing episode with him. I definitely want to put in a bid for you to get on the Joe Rogan podcast. So we if anyone who listens to our podcast somehow knows the management over there, we got to get you on there.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate that. I would love to be on the Joe Rogan show. I really like to listen to whatever he puts out. It would be a great platform, and I would love to share the stuff that I know something about with his listeners as well. Definitely. Yeah.
Cool. So wrapping up here. So if our listeners want to find out more about you, where should they go?
Well, right now you can look me up on Facebook. Basically, Dr. Kenneth Jay. Same Instagram handle. And if you want to check out my website, it's Cardio Code Sports Science. It's a long URL, but Cardio Code Sports Science.
We'll put it in the link when we post this. Awesome.
Yeah,
cool.
And that is just basically reach out to me, and I'll love to hear from your listeners as well.
Awesome. Well, I had so much fun. And even though we've copied a lot of the topics we've talked about face-to-face here, I could listen to you talk for hours about this stuff. And by the way, while you were talking, if you saw me looking away, it was because I was writing notes, because these are all things I'm going to be looking up and also reminding myself to. Absolutely fascinating. Really cool to talk to you. Hope you're doing well. Hope to see you again at some point in the future.
Be too long, but let's see what happens. And I can't wait to pick your brain more as well, because I learned from you as well. The talks that we have whenever I visit your fantastic school in City Wing Chun in Manhattan, I just love the time that we get to spend together. And thank you so much for the t-shirt as well. I love it.
This comes from the heart shirt on. Awesome. Cool. Dr. J, as I like to call you, with no relation to the basketball player, was absolutely fascinating. We got to do this again, and hope you're doing well, and we'll talk soon.
Okay. Thanks, man.